Mr. Hollowburn, it's a great pleasure to see you in the chair. Having now wiped my microphone, I feel like I'm ready to go. So today's debate is clearly about the recent report on China's rapid expansion of mass labour programs in Tibet. This was a paper published by a leading human rights advisor and scholar, Iain Duncan, who co-published it with a group of which I'm a member called IPAC, which is the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. There are others in this room who are themselves also part of that. That is both left and right parliamentarians in now 17 countries who are concerned about the behaviour of China across a range of issues. And this was co-published at the time. Iain Duncan is a scholar in this area and has previously published a paper with IPAC also on the forced sterilisation of Uyghur women. I will touch on that, Mr. Hollowburn, shortly. So he is the one that has uncovered this through existing government papers. That is the interesting thing about this. None of this is secret. In a sense, it is quite open, and these government papers spell out exactly what has been going on. These are shocking findings, and funnily enough, with all the other debates about China, which I want to touch on in conclusion, but it is important to note that Tibet has gone, in a way, rather forgotten in all of these events. It's been an issue for a while, and then it's disappeared, and nobody seems to talk about it. What this paper has done has reminded us that even over a longer period than anything else, the Chinese authorities have been bearing down on the human rights in Tibet of those of the indigenous population in Tibet for some time. But the findings on this report are particularly interesting because they show that there has been mandatory, and I use this word advisedly, vocational training. That basically means sort of driving out the sense of identity of those people in Tibet. So these programs, and alongside those, forcible labour transfer schemes. These are sort of slightly gentle words. What they mean is that people are being taken from one place and put into camps, a lot like the Uyghurs that we uncovered, where they are forced to do labour, to hard labour, on all sorts of areas without proper pay or support. Over 500,000 labourers have now been collected together into these camps in the first 7 months of 2020. And local government officials are required by the government to meet quotas for what they term as recruitment to the scheme. It bears nothing like any concept of recruitment that we might understand. It basically means they have to get people in those categories into those camps as quickly as they can. This is overseen by strict military management, includes enforced indoctrination and intrusive surveillance of participants. And labourers also may be forcibly transferred to work all over China from their homes. In other words, this is not just camps in Tibet. This is people who are being moved around to fulfil requirements elsewhere. This has, of course, close similarities, which I want to touch on, to the training and labour transfer in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And the government attempts to dilute Tibetan identity are really critical here, and this is being done through this forced cultural assimilation. And this pattern is going on in a number of areas. And these government documents, interestingly, state that the programs aim to reform Tibetan cultural, and I quote this, backwardness. Cultural backwardness. That is an interesting concept. It is a relative concept, and of course its relativity is defined by those in power, that is to say, the Communist Party of China. And this is achieved by enforcing learning of Mandarin and weakening, however they can, the religious influence that exists amongst those who would claim to be indigenously Tibetan. But, Mr. Hollowburn, this is not an isolated incident, because we have seen this kind of pattern of eradication of ethnicity, or attempted eradication, go on now across China. I mean, we know now from the parallel report that was published a little bit before this on the Uyghurs, that at least 1 million Uyghurs are in mass arbitrary detention in Xinjiang. Almost 400 prison camps in the region, more still under development at the moment. It's disgraceful, but we understand that Western fashion brands are using supply chains where such forced labour is prevalent, and I'm sure this applies also in due course, if not already, to the Tibetans. And the government-sponsored forced sterilisation and birth suppression in the Uyghur populations, which we believe is true, would meet, I believe, the genocide criteria. But we have yet to get the UN to even look at this at the moment, and that is the key. And civil servants placed in these Uyghur homes to monitor their behaviour, and children whose parents are detained are being taken from their families and placed in state facilities. But, Mr. Hollowbone, it goes on. It's not just the Tibetans, it's not just the Uyghurs, it is now also the Christians. Party members who profess a faith are now subject to disciplinary procedures. Arrest and detention of Christian leaders, such as Pastor Wang Yi of the Early Rain Church, detained in December 2018 and sentenced to 9 years in prison for, in quotes, inciting to subvert state power. I will indeed.
The right honourable gentleman for giving way, because these acts of repression never happen all at once. It's never a single thing that happens immediately. And does he share my concern at the reports that we're now hearing from southern Mongolia of the start of the same process of cultural and linguistic oppression of the local population there, which, if left if we don't call it out, you will probably see the same thing then start to happen there?
Yes, it's a pleasure to give way to the right honourable gentleman. He's been very early in on this and has been calling this out for some time, and I congratulate him for that. And I agree with him. We have to look at the starting point. People took their eyes off Tibet, but now look what's happening. The Uyghurs, people didn't want to talk about this, but look how far that has advanced. It is happening everywhere. And my point about the Christians is this has been going on for a long time. And there are threats, for example, in the Christian groups to withhold state support from any low-income Christian families if they do not give up their religious belief, and similar experience for Catholic churches as well. So it's not just churches that the government doesn't consider to be registered. These are also churches that they might even consider registered. And then you've got the Falun Gong. They've had almost the most appalling behaviour to them. 610 Office, which is a security agency tasked with solely persecuting the Falun Gong. Detainees who do not renounce Falun Gong beliefs are subject to re-education through labour. Reports of beatings, solitary confinement, 24-hour monitoring, rack torture, tiger bench torture, water torture, stress position torture, forced feeding for those who are on hunger strike, forced injections of unknown drugs, and, of course, most shockingly of all, now confirmed stories of organ harvesting from those who have been incarcerated and treated like this. And Liu Gufu, a Falun Gong practitioner from Beijing, as I give this an example, was twice sent to RTL camps, these are the retraining camps, in Beijing. He reports being deprived of sleep, not allowed to use a bathroom or drink water. She was forced to consume feces and toilet water and was given unidentifiable drugs which made her lose consciousness. Mr. Hollowbone, I call on the government to call this out. And I also urge the government to do a series of things which I think would put the UK as a lead advocate in all of this. Number one, I think we now need to look at mandatory sanctions with regards to global human rights abuses. Sanctions such as travel bans or asset freezes. Officials who are responsible should have those Magnitsky arrangements set on them, and for the use of forced or compulsory labour in Tibet, and for that matter, in other areas too. The government should open a way for similar judgments to be issued on the cases regarding abuses against Xinjiang's, Uyghurs, and other minorities in China's that I was touching on. The Lord's amendment to the Trade Bill, new clause 68, to nullify trade arrangements past and future if the High Court makes a preliminary determination that proposed trade partner has perpetrated genocide. I would urge the government to support that amendment in the Lords, because I can tell them now, should this come to the Commons, I will absolutely support such an amendment. And I urge the government also to meet GDP targets. China's economy needs to grow by some 7.5% a year, and they are, therefore, under the cover of that, being given the capacity by Western companies and by Western governments who are turning a blind eye to behave like this. It's also worth reminding ourselves, beyond even the human rights abuses, China is now in breach of WTO rules endlessly across the piece. They incentivize companies through illegal discounts, tax breaks, and subsidies. Even Volkswagen reported they had to buy a quota of components from local Chinese suppliers or pay more than double the standard import tax on these parts, which violates WTO rules, which everybody else is meant to obey. And China favors exporting finished products, which means basically they force companies to manufacture and produce. So these supply chain risk profiles are all in there, and they're there for us as well. And these supply chains in Tibet, Xinjiang, and other regions are therefore linked to forced labour, and the government has to make it clear to British business that it is unacceptable to be in the slightest bit involved in any way with these chains. And I also ask the government to demand reciprocal access to Tibet and other regions, such as Xinjiang, in order to allow for independent international investigation into these reports of forced labour, and to call for a UN Special Rapporteur on Tibet. Mr. Hollowburn, in conclusion, the peculiarity of this is that if this was any other country in the world, every government would be calling it out. They would be demanding change. Imagine if this was a country in Europe or Africa or whatever, it would be immediate. There would be demands, there would be debates in the UN. This doesn't happen. Far too much of what we think and do about China is influenced massively now by this concern about getting goods, manufacturers, investments, etc., organised. And yet this country at the moment is involved in occupying the South China Seas, with the UN has said they have no right to that at all, and yet they are demanding and controlling whole areas of that. They've had border disputes recently with India, in which Indian soldiers have been killed, aggressive behaviour. And then we come to Hong Kong. I mean, how much more can we say about Hong Kong? Their abuse of what's going on, their dismissal of an international agreement with regards to the legalities, and also the incarceration now of many of those peaceful protesters and their shipment to China for prosecution, where they will certainly not get a fair trial. And by the way, I ask the government, what do they think of British judges now being employed still on the bench in Hong Kong? Surely it's time that we said enough. They can no longer give a kind of cover to what is going on in Hong Kong. This has to stop, for goodness sake. So I just simply, in conclusion, say there is one other action that the government can take. The Winter Olympics are planned to be in China. And many of us now believe that had this, as I said, been any other country, there would now be calls for these Olympics to be moved. I simply say to the government, they will have to take a stance on this pretty soon. Overall, Mr. Hollowburn, we are dealing now with a country that has, it appears now, bullied and threatened its way through all of this. It is imposing the most dreadful and terrible things on many of its own people. It is abusing human rights, and many now believe that it may even be guilty of a form of genocide. I simply say to my government, it is time now for them to stand up. It is time for this government to lead, and it is time for this government to act.